What if a child buried in ancient Cambodia was carrying a secret that could shake the story of an entire region? What if the bones of that child were quietly saying that India and Cambodia were connected far earlier and far more deeply than most people ever imagined? Before we open that grave and follow the clues, stay with me to the end, because this is one of those stories that starts in silence and ends by changing how you see whole civilizations. For a long time, the common version of this story sounded simple. Ancient Southeast Asia had its own people, its own traditions, its own rhythm of life. Then, much later, Indian ideas arrived across the sea. Traders came, priests came, stories came, scripts came, religions came, kings borrowed symbols of power, temples rose, Sanskrit words appeared, and over time, places like early Cambodia were influenced by India. That version is not completely wrong. In fact, parts of it are clearly true. Indian culture really did leave a deep mark on mainland Southeast Asia. You can see it in art, in religion, in royal ideas, in old inscriptions, in the shape of myths that traveled across water and took root in new lands. Historians have long talked about these links. Archaeologists have studied them for years. But there was always a huge question hiding underneath that story. How deep did that contact really go? Was it mostly trade and culture? Was it mostly ideas moving from port to port? Or were real people moving too? Were families crossing the sea? Were communities mixing? Were the roots of early states shaped not only by borrowed beliefs, but by human lives joining together? For a long time, nobody could answer that question with real certainty. There were theories, of course. There were old texts. There were legends. There were patterns in art and politics. There were arguments over how early Indian influence began and how strong it really was. Some researchers believed there must have been migration. Others thought the influence was mostly cultural, mostly elite, mostly symbolic. And that debate might have continued for many more years, if not for one ancient burial. Not a king, not a famous warrior, not a man remembered in stone, a child. At a place called Angkor Borei, near the Mekong Delta region of Cambodia, archaeologists had already found signs of a very old world. This was a region tied to the early state often linked with Funan, one of the earliest known political centers in mainland Southeast Asia. The area mattered. It sat in a landscape of rivers, trade routes, and movement. It was the kind of place where worlds could meet without asking permission. Inside the Vat Komnou cemetery at Angkor Borei, researchers studied human remains from long ago. One individual, known by a scientific code, was a male child. A direct radiocarbon date placed him roughly between 78 and 234 CE. Stop and think about that for a second. This child lived nearly 2,000 years ago, long before modern borders, long before the nations we know today, long before the world could imagine DNA testing, and yet, almost 2,000 years later, his body would speak. That is where this story stops being ordinary. When scientists analyzed the child's ancient DNA and compared it with genetic data from different populations, they found something remarkable. The results suggested that he carried a very large amount of South Asian ancestry. Not a tiny trace, not a faint shadow, a substantial amount, around 42 to 49% in the study's best models. That was the moment the old story began to crack, because this was not just evidence of cultural influence floating across the ocean like a loose idea. This pointed to real human mixing, real ancestry, real family history, real contact between South Asians and local people in mainland Southeast Asia at a very early time. And the shock did not end there. The likely source population, according to the models used in the study, pointed not just vaguely to South Asia, but most plausibly to populations from southern India. Suddenly, the story became much more personal. Not just trade, not just temples, not just symbols, people. If this mystery already feels larger than one grave, tell me the one word that comes to your mind right now. Trade, roots, sea, or identity. Sometimes a single word shows what part of history is pulling you in. Now here is where the tension gets even stronger. Because before, the study, ancient DNA from mainland Southeast Asia, had not clearly shown this kind of South Asian ancestry in older individuals from the region. That matters. It means this child stood apart from the ancient people previously studied. In simple terms, he was not just another data point. He was a surprise, a very big surprise. The researchers even noted that this finding may push the timeline of South Asian gene flow into Cambodia much earlier than some earlier genetic estimates based only on living populations had suggested. In other words, this connection may have started about 1,000 years earlier than some people thought. 1,000 years. That is not a small correction. That is the kind of change that makes historians sit up straight. But before we run too far, we need to slow down and be careful, because this is where many stories go wrong. One DNA result does not rewrite every page of history by itself. The researchers were cautious. They made it clear that this was one individual. Just one. That means we cannot use This child alone to claim that all early Cambodians had the same ancestry, or that all of Funan was shaped in the same exact way. The ancient world was complex. Populations were mixed in different ways. Some communities may have seen more contact than others. That caution is important. But caution does not kill the mystery, it sharpens it. Because even with those limits, the discovery still says something powerful. By the first few centuries CE in the region of ancient Cambodia, there were already people whose family lines linked mainland Southeast Asia and South Asia closely enough to appear clearly in their DNA. So now we have our first curiosity loop. If this child had that ancestry, who were his parents? Who moved? Who stayed? Who crossed the sea? And how often was this happening? Nobody can answer all of that yet. But the very fact that we have to ask those questions tells you how big this discovery really is. Try to picture the world this child lived in. The sea between India and Southeast Asia was not an empty wall. It was a road. A dangerous road, yes. A road shaped by wind, tide, courage, and luck. But still a road. Traders knew the seasonal monsoon winds. Boats crossed the Bay of Bengal. Goods moved. Beads moved. Metals moved. Beliefs moved. Language moved. And with all of that movement, why would people not move too? That question sounds obvious now. But history is full of things that feel obvious only after evidence arrives. Maybe a merchant sailed east and stayed. Maybe a family traveled with goods and never returned. Maybe local elites formed ties with newcomers. Maybe marriages linked communities across water. Maybe children were born into worlds that did not fit neat categories. That last thought matters most, because history is often told through kings, wars, monuments, and maps. But real history is also built in kitchens, in harbors, in marriages, in grief, in hope, in children born between worlds. And that is why this child matters so much. He is not just evidence of contact. He is evidence of human closeness. Someone held him. Someone named him. Someone fed him. Someone buried him. Somewhere in his short life, the huge map of Asia became a family story. Now let's go back to the common version for a moment, because we have not finished breaking it apart. Many older explanations of Indian influence in Southeast Asia leaned heavily on culture. They focused on religion, court ceremony, writing systems, political ideas, and art. These things are real and important. But the danger is that culture can feel distant. It can sound like a king copied a symbol, and that was the end of the matter. But DNA does not let the story stay distant. DNA brings the story down from the palace and into the body. It asks uncomfortable questions. It forces us to imagine that the making of early Southeast Asian states may have involved not only borrowed ideas, but also living communities tied together across the sea. It suggests that what we call influence may sometimes have also been kinship. And that changes the emotional weight of the story, because borrowed culture can be removed from the heart. Family cannot. There is another twist here, too. The child's South Asian ancestry was estimated to be much higher than what is seen in present-day Cambodians in the same comparison framework. That does not mean modern Cambodians are somehow less real or more real. It simply shows that populations change over time. History moves, peoples mix in new ways. Some lines become stronger, some fade, some blend into wider communities. The past is not a frozen picture. It is a river, and rivers carry everything forward. So this one ancient child may show a moment when the connection was especially visible, especially close, especially strong. A human snapshot from a deeper, larger process. But here comes the second curiosity loop. If this child was buried in Cambodia with such strong South Asian ancestry, was he part of a local community that already accepted mixed families as normal? Or was his family unusual? Were they recent arrivals? Were they connected to trade networks? Did they hold special status? Or were they simply ordinary people living in an extraordinary age? We do not know, and sometimes history becomes more gripping, not when all answers arrive, but when one answer opens 5 bigger questions. If you know someone who thinks ancient history is just dates and dead stones, share this story with them. Sometimes all it takes is one child from the past to remind us that history is really about people. Now let's talk about why this finding lands so hard in the story of Cambodia itself. Now, when people think of Cambodia's deep past, their minds often jump to Angkor, to massive temples, to carved stone faces, to empire and greatness. But Cambodia's story did not begin there. Long before Angkor reached its height, earlier centers were already forming. Power, belief, and identity were already growing in the region. The world around the Mekong Delta was already alive with exchange. That is where the old name Funan enters the discussion. Funan is one of those names that feels half lit by history and half hidden by fog. It appears in old records. It is often described as one of the earliest state-level societies in mainland Southeast Asia, influenced by Indian culture. But many details remain debated. Scholars continue to discuss what Funan really was, how it worked, how wide its reach was, and how people within it understood themselves. That uncertainty matters, because when history is unclear, people tend to fill the gaps with simple stories. Simple stories feel safe. Simple stories are easy to teach. Simple stories sound clean, but the real past is rarely clean. The real past is mixed, layered, messy, human, and this DNA result fits that deeper truth. It suggests that the birth of early political and cultural systems in the region may not have happened in isolation. It may have been part of a world already tied together by sea routes, belief systems, and personal relationships. South Asians may not have been distant visitors standing outside the local world. At least in some cases, they may have been inside it, living in it, marrying into it, becoming part of it. That may be one reason the discovery hit so hard. It moves Indian contact with Southeast Asia out of the abstract and into lived reality. And let's be honest, there is something deeply moving about that. We spend so much time today arguing about identity as if every people in history lived in sealed boxes, as if old civilizations were pure, still, untouched, separate. But the evidence again and again points to something else. The ancient world was moving. Ports were meeting points. Frontiers were porous. Human beings were curious, ambitious, brave, afraid, hungry, spiritual, practical, and always on the move. That does not erase local identity. It makes it more real. Cultures are not weak because they meet others. They become what they are through those meetings. Cambodia did not become less Cambodian because people, goods, and ideas crossed the sea. If anything, the region's power came from the way it absorbed, reshaped, and made something new from what arrived. That is not imitation. That is creation. And now we come to another important tension. When people hear a discovery like this, some rush too fast in one direction. They say, "See, this proves the whole civilization came from somewhere else." But that would be a mistake. The evidence does not say that. The researchers did not say that. Local populations were already there. Local cultures were already there. Southeast Asia was not an empty stage waiting for outsiders to write its story. But others rush too hard in the opposite direction. They say, "No, this was just outside influence, nothing more." And that also becomes harder to defend when a child in ancient Cambodia shows such strong South Asian ancestry. The truth may be more powerful than either extreme. Not replacement, not isolation. Connection. That is the word sitting at the center of this story. Connection that crossed water. Connection that entered bloodlines. Connection that may have helped shape the early world of Cambodia in ways both visible and invisible. And still, one mystery remains, hanging over everything. Why this child? Out of all the people who lived, worked, traveled, loved, and died in that world, why do we have this evidence from him? Was it luck? Was his community special? Are there more graves waiting to reveal similar stories? How much of the bigger picture is still buried? Under soil, river mud, and time? That is what makes ancient DNA so powerful and so frustrating at the same time. It gives you a voice from the past, but only in fragments. It can reveal ancestry, but not a full life story. It can tell you there was mixing, but not exactly how people felt about it. It can show movement, but not the sound of the boat, or the fear of the storm, or the look on a mother's face when land first appeared on the horizon. Still, even fragments can shake the world. If you've made it this far, let me ask you something simple. Do you think the past is more interesting when it gets more complicated? If yes, stay with this, because the last part of this story may be the most human of all. Imagine the adults around this child. Maybe one side of his family had deep roots in mainland Southeast Asia. Maybe another side traced back toward South Asia, perhaps toward southern India, the most plausible source in the models. Maybe his existence was the result of trade routes becoming family routes. Maybe he grew up hearing more than one language. Maybe he lived in a place where different customs touched each other every day, or maybe not. Maybe his life felt completely normal to him and to the people around him. That may be the most important thing to remember. The categories that shock us today may not have shocked the ancient world at all. We are the ones looking backward with hard boxes in our minds. The past may have been softer, more fluid, more practical, more open than we think. People have always found reasons to move. Safety, profit, faith, marriage, curiosity, hunger, ambition, disaster, hope, love. Why should the first centuries of Cambodia have been any different? And when you place this child into that larger ocean world, the discovery begins to feel less like a random surprise and more like a missing piece. A missing piece, yes, but still a powerful one. Because once you see it, other things start to line up. The trade routes make more sense. The cultural links feel more human. The rise of early Indianized states feels less like distant borrowing and more like shared participation. The old debate about influence becomes a deeper question about community, and the word contact starts to feel too weak. Contact sounds like two worlds touched for a second. This may have been much more than contact. This may have been entanglement, lives joining lives, families joining families, worlds joining worlds. That does not make the story smaller, it makes it larger. Because now the history of ancient Cambodia is not just a local story or an imported story, it becomes a story of creation through meeting. A story of what happens when people from different shores do not just exchange goods, but shape each other's future. And maybe that is why the result felt so shocking. Not only because it was early, not only because the ancestry level was high, not only because southern India appeared as the most plausible source in the genetic models, but because the discovery forces a deeper emotional truth into view. Civilizations are not only built by walls, they are also built by crossings, sometimes by sea crossings, sometimes by cultural crossings, sometimes by family crossings, and sometimes the people who prove that we're never meant to be famous, just a child in a grave, just bones in the ground, just silence waiting for science. There is one more caution we should keep close before we close this story. Ancient DNA is powerful, but it is not magic. The study itself warned that modern populations are only used as stand-ins for ancient sources. The real ancient source populations may not have looked exactly like people living today. And because this result comes from one individual, much more evidence is needed. More samples, more sites, more comparison, more patience. That matters because good history is not built on excitement alone. It is built on discipline. So no, this one result does not solve every mystery of early Cambodia. It does not tell us everything about Funan. It does not prove a simple one-line answer for how Indian influence spread. If anyone tries to sell you that easy version, be careful. But it does prove something important. It proves that the old flat story is no longer enough. It proves that by the first centuries CE, at least some people in ancient Cambodia were living evidence of deep connections with South Asia. It proves that the sea was not a barrier in the way many modern minds imagine. It proves that ancestry, culture, and state formation may have been tied together earlier than many had believed. And maybe most of all, it proves that the past still has the power to surprise us. That is one of the most beautiful things about history. You think the big discoveries have already happened. You think the maps are finished. You think the story is settled. Then one buried child says, no, you do not know enough yet. No, your neat categories are too small. No, the world was wider than you thought. If this story changed how you see the ancient world, leave one quiet sign in the comments. A single word, connected. Because maybe that word explains more of human history than all our borders ever could. In the end, what shocked researchers was not just a number in a DNA model, it was what that number meant. It meant that nearly 2,000 years ago, in the land that would one day be part of Cambodia's long and powerful story, a child lived whose ancestry carried the memory of two regions meeting, not in theory, not in legend, not only in trade goods or temple forms, in his very body. And once you understand that, the old world stops looking distant. You can almost hear the harbor. You can almost feel the wet river air. You can almost see the boats pushing through monsoon waters. You can almost imagine strangers becoming neighbors, neighbors becoming family, and family becoming history. That is the deeper truth hidden inside this discovery. The past was never as separate as we pretend. The great civilizations of Asia did not grow in silence, one behind each wall. They met, they exchanged, they changed. And from those meetings, new worlds were born. So when people ask what scientists found in ancient Cambodian DNA, the real answer is bigger than a lab result. They found evidence that the story of Cambodia and the story of India's connection to Southeast Asia may have begun not only through influence, but through intimacy, not only through contact, but through kinship, not only through ideas crossing the sea, but through people carrying entire worlds inside them. And all this time, that truth was lying in the ground, waiting for someone to listen.